Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Nick Chatter. He is Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School in the UK. He works on rationality and language using a range of theoretical and experimental approaches. He has over 200 publications, has won four national awards for psychological research, and has served as associate editor for the journals Cognitive Science, Psychological Review, and Psychological Science. He was elected a Fellow of the Cognitive Science Society in 2010 and a Fellow of the British Academy in 2012. And is also the author of The Mind is Flat, The Illusion of Mental Depth, and The Improvised Mind, which will be the main topic of our discussion today. And so, Dr. Chatter, welcome to the show. Thank you a lot for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and welcome everybody.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so I would like to ask you first, because it seems to me that your book is very unintuitive for people and for myself as well. But what is the basic premise of The Mind is Flat?
Yes, so I think we all have the intuition that underlying the things we say and do, there are reasons, and those reasons cause what we say and do. So if you ask me, why did I go to the shop? I think, I went to the shop because I wanted to buy a newspaper or some coffee, and I believe that the shop has some newspaper or some coffee, and I also believed I had some money, and I believe the shop is open. And I have the idea that there's a story in terms of beliefs and motives, desires, which is driving my behavior. And also, not only that, we tend to think that not all of those, the stories we tell, are actually ones we're aware of. We tend to think there's conscious things like that. I'm conscious of wanting to go to the shop to buy coffee, but maybe I have other motives. Maybe I have secret reasons why I like that shop rather than some other shop, or maybe I have a hidden desire to see a particular person who serves in this shop, or who knows. So we have the idea that there is, as well as conscious beliefs and motives, there might be unconscious ones too. And of course, ever since Freud, this has become, although I think a very unusual and strange idea, it's become so natural we imagine it's obvious that there must be unconscious motives, beliefs, a whole world of this kind. And I want to suggest that that is in fact entirely backwards, that the justifications, the explanations we give of our behavior are entirely retrospective, they're rationalizations. So when I do something, if you ask me, why did you do that? I can tell a story because I'm a very creative and clever storyteller, as is everybody. But it's not that I'm telling you what my brain was actually thinking about. I'm making that stuff up. So the idea is that I'm a storyteller about my own behavior in just the same way as I'm a storyteller about other people's behavior. So I see someone else going into the shop and you say, why did they do that? And I say, I bet they wanted some coffee. In fact, they've said something about coffee before when I last saw them, or I think they were wanting to find out the latest exciting news, and I can do that. But obviously, I don't know the causes of their behaviour directly. I can't look inside their brain, and I think the illusion we have in our own case is that we can look inside our own brains. I think, well, when it's me going to the shop or doing anything, I have a direct line of access into my own mind, and I can tell you what I'm thinking or what I'm believing. And I think that's a mistake. Another just small way to make that very vivid, I think, is to think about what happens when we speak and argue. So if I say something, I defend a position, or I make a claim, or I say I like something, you could think, well, of course, you must have had a belief or a desire or a preference or something, and then decided to express that. But that seems to imply that I'm always formulating my thoughts and then turning them into language, as if the thoughts are coming into being or being sort of drawn out of a sort of an inner sea of all the thoughts I have and then turned into language. But that seems a strange idea, because it seems that I'm making these thoughts up, I'm saying these things now. It's like I'm deciding what to say now. And I think that is correct. It's not that I already have all my beliefs and desires and so on formulated. When you ask me something, I produce an answer. If you ask me why, I will defend it, but I'm defending it in the moment. I'm thinking, well, okay, you've a good question. Why is that true? Well, I think this. Why is that true? Well, I think this. But the illusion is thinking, no, all of that was present all along. It was all just sitting there inside my mind, waiting to be looked at. In fact, I think we can't look inside our minds at all. I think we have no capacity to introspect our beliefs and desires, except for some very, very, very minimal exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So in your book, you use an analogy that I think is very useful for people who are not really into at least the psychological or neuroscientific literature to understand what you're saying a bit better at least. That is, you compare the way in which we interpret other people's behavior and the way by which we attribute beliefs, goals, intentions, motivations to them, and the same way writers, for example, do the same with fictional characters. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think this analogy with fiction is very interesting. So when we read a book, and the example I'm very fond of is the Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, but any other book would work. You have the feeling that the characters are very rich, very complicated. But when you think about what's actually you're told about those characters, it's very little, actually. You learn very little about their personality directly. They do things and they say things. And from that, you have a sense that you can make up an understanding of why they're behaving as they do. And first of all, I think that is very interesting, but it's also very misleading in that actually, when you think about it, if you ask yourself about a character like Anna Karenina, say, if you think, well, what actually does Tolstoy say about this person? One of the things that's really striking is that he doesn't actually say anything about even her physical appearance. I think you have the impression that she's an attractive woman. You don't actually know whether she's tall or short or blonde or brunette or anything. And if you think about her character, you know a little bit about that, but even that's incredibly ambiguous. So it could be that she's incredibly, ultimately shallow and superficial, or it could be that she's a tortured soul who's broken by the rigidity of Russian society. There are many interpretations. Tolstoy doesn't give you any of those interpretations specifically. And what's interesting, I think, about the process of reading is that, of course, it's not often said that we are ourselves creating the characters as we're going along. And if I ask myself, well, I ask myself a question about why Anna, for example, why in the denouement of the book she kills herself. Why she does that? That's not clear. It's not clear. You can tell different stories about that. So one of the things I stress in the book is that if you were to ask Anna herself, if she was a real person, if you ask Anna herself about her own mind and how she's working and why she was contemplating suicide, she would be in no better position than I as the reader. In fact, very much the same position. She'd have a bit more detailed knowledge of her own life because she's seen more of it. I've only seen a few snippets that Tolstoy decided to write, but she's seen a bit more. But she doesn't really have any deep insights either. And if you think about your own life, you think, well, why do I choose the career or the partner or the life that I have? Why did I decide to have children or not have children? None of us really have anything much to say about this either. We can tell stories, and we do tell stories. And they're important. I think just as literature is an important thing, the stories we tell about our own lives are important. But we're kidding ourselves if we think they're more than stories. So in the case, of course, of a fictional character, it's obvious that there's no real truth. There's no real truth about why Anna Karenina jumped under a train because there's nothing, but there's just the words on Tolstoy's page. There's nothing beneath them. And however much you examine the words and examine the pages and examine Tolstoy's notes, and even if you ask Tolstoy, there's nothing more than the written, essentially the written documents. And in our own case, I think that's true. There's nothing more than the behaviour and the things we say, and then the interpretations are varied and numerous, but there's no deep inner truth. And I think the final point would be the illusion I think we often have is that we think, well, there must be a deep inner truth. It must be in my head somewhere. And I bet you some neuroscientist who had a really, really clever scanner or had some probes to put in my brain, they could find it. They could say, look, there it is. There's the real reason. And I think that's just a complete illusion. It's no more true than thinking that if we could only really put Tolstoy's manuscript under the microscope, we'd find the real reason for Anna's behaviour.
Very well. Okay, so one of these days I will also be interviewing Dr. Alexander Rosenberg about his book, How History Gets Things Wrong. And I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's very interesting because your books overlap in several points. And I would like to ask you, do you think that the way by which we attribute intentionality and motives to people and the way we interpret, for example, historical events, that could be problematic? And for example,
Yes.
journalists do this a lot because they found out over time that the best way to attract people's attentions is to present things in a narrative. But I mean, most of the time the narrative is not really the most objective way to present information to people, right?
Yes, I think there is a lot of overlap, and I think the general problem with the historical style of explanation, not that I think that there's some alternative better style, just the reason it's hard to explain history is that, well, the reason, a clue that we're in danger of falling into a trap is the thought that people often have that we have to have some time flowing by, and then when we look back we find we can understand something much better. So we say things like, we really don't, we're too close to the breakdown of the Soviet Union to really understand it, but if we can wait another 50 or 100 years, maybe historians will look back and then they will understand. And I think the answer to that is yes. What will happen in 50 or 100 years is that we will have consolidated a narrative and decided it's the right one. But of course, we don't know any more in the future. In fact, we know less, if anything. So, in fact, I mean, people are often an oft-quoted remark is that journalism is the first draft of history. But the illusion is thinking that the first draft is then improved on and improved on and improved on and perfected by those later drafts. And of course, if you think of it as a narrative, as a story, of course, that's going to be true. The first time you write the story is a bit messy and there are problems and it doesn't fit together. And then you can make the story more and more convincing, but it doesn't make it more true. It means that all the awkwardness and the difficulties and the alternative interpretations get forgotten about, and we have a narrative we all believe. And so I think, yes, I think our tendency to tell stories is unavoidable. It's the way we understand and see the world, but it potentially misleads us. And another sort of way in which it misleads us, which I think is much thought about these days, is that we tend to want to interpret everything as having a reason. So things that happen by chance are very puzzling to us. So if you look at the kind of narratives you see as the stock market moves up and down, it's sort of almost comical that every day there'll be many articles in the newspaper saying stocks up due to something something something, and stocks down again due to something else, and then they're up again due to something else, and there's this continual sort of updated story. But of course, in practice, and as finance theorists know all too well, it looks awfully like a random walk. Right? It looks like a random walk, but nonetheless, we tell a story every day, and I think that's true quite broadly, and both because the world is very complex, chaotic, and difficult to understand, and so the stories. So we often there is no story, but even if there is a story, it may be far too complicated for us to understand it, or we just don't have the relevant information. So we will impose a story, we will create a story, and as time goes by, we'll become more and more convinced. But yes, we should be very skeptical.
Right. Okay, so would you say that then all the contents that we attribute to our minds and either conscious or subconscious, that they are nothing but illusions, maybe?
I think in a sense they are. I think they are illusions if we think of them as the causes of our behavior. So I think the illusion is thinking that, supposing you say to me, do you believe that the Earth goes around the sun? And I may think, yes, I do. Now, you might think, well, I guess the reason you said that, I said yes, was because I had that belief. And the belief is somehow lurking in my mind. And the belief, you might think, is totally different from anything in language. It's something very deep and profound and locked into my memory. And I think I'd want to say something very different from that. I'd want to say that, in fact, this goes back to the flatness of the mind. that in fact what's happening is that I'm recalling other superficial episodes that I've experienced. So I'm remembering that at school people said the Earth is round and it goes around the sun and the moon goes around the Earth. So these are things that I've heard this many times, many people have said it. So I think, and it seems reasonable. So I guess when you ask me, I say, I guess I believe that. But what I'm doing there is I'm referring my in the moment to previous past memories, specific memories that I can't remember when I heard them, but those memories are in there. And so it's not as if I'm looking into some kind of deep knowledge structure, some sort of something which is somehow mysterious and in a kind of hidden code in my brain. I'm referring to specific memories. Of course, those memories are in my brain, but they're memories of concrete events, things that have happened. So I suppose another sort of way to stress the flatness point is that for me, the only things that go, the brain essentially does deals with the world in the moment. So I'm in this conversation, we're chatting, so the thing we're thinking about is this conversation. I would like to argue that the brain is doing very little apart from that. It's doing some breathing and it's making sure I don't fall over, and it's doing some very basic things. But roughly speaking, that's all that's going on. And I think that's always the case. So your brain is a very sequential, serial machine. It does one thing at a time, roughly, or at least each network in the brain does one thing at a time. And most things we do require many networks. So it basically blocks out the whole brain. And then when you're asked a question, you're referring back to memory traces of things your brain has done in the past. But so you've had many past conversations, many past experiences, and those are traces of those will remain. So every new action or thought I have is referring back to those other thoughts and actions, memories of past thoughts and actions. But each of those was once on the surface. You know, it's just another thing that flowed through my mind. It's all conscious in some sense, it's all conscious at the time. It's all in my awareness, and then it's just a memory trace, and then maybe I bring it back again. But what is not happening is that underneath the conscious experience, there's a kind of giant library and a team of librarians and a team of analysts who are going through all my knowledge and organizing it and sifting it and putting it into order, and maybe with some hidden, some of the material is in restricted sections of the library which we can't really access. I think that's all in fact illusory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happens is that I mean, it's very difficult at this point to use the proper word, but I'm going with mind. Would you say that perhaps at a subconscious level, there are operations going on that we don't have conscious access to, and then simply the results of that operations are the things that pop up in our minds, and those are the only things we have access to?
Yes, I want to say, I think that there's I want to make a distinction between the mind as we think of it as a conscious phenomenon, so the sort of conscious flow of experience, the conscious flow of words and so on that we experience, and the activity of the brain. So the activity of the brain is incredibly complicated and involves amazingly complicated computations. And I think all of those the activity of the brain is never conscious. We've never ever had any conscious access to any of it, in my view. The only thing we do have conscious access to is essentially the organization of perceptual experience. So when I see a face, I can see Ricardo, or I can say a friendly person. Then I can have that experience. I can have that sensation of interpreting a facial expression, or recognizing somebody, or recognizing a color, or recognizing a word. And actually, those things are rather sequential. If I'm recognizing a word, I can't recognize another word. If I'm recognizing a face, I can't recognize a word at the same time. Basically, I can recognize one pattern at a time. And what I'm conscious of is just that the experience of recognizing and understanding one pattern, and then another, then another. And of course, sometimes those patterns can be drawn from my memory too. So I can shut my eyes and I can try and remember what somebody looks like, or I can say a sentence rather than hear a sentence. I can generate as well as receive. But all I'm ever doing is experiencing this sort of conscious flow of one experience, then another, then another. Now, the brain, of course, underlying all of this is doing complicated things in conjuring up each pattern, each interpretation. And in fact, I think what it's doing is it's an extremely complicated process of connecting up the current, let's take the example of perception, the current stimulus in front of me, the current thing I'm looking at or focusing on, word or face or whatever, and it's connecting that with my knowledge of past words and faces and many other things too. So I might see a person and they might remind me of where I saw them last and which country they're from and what their interests are and many other things. So I can draw out, I can link up my current perceptual experience with a great deal of information from memory. But what I'm not, and those memories themselves will be essentially past experiences. They're not some special thing. They're not different in character. But that whole process of searching your memory for relevant information and drawing it out is something we are completely unconscious of. We have no conscious access to that at all. And it's the same, not just with perception, it's the same with action and speech. So I do something, I say something. The processes that underlie that depend on drawing on enormous numbers of past memories. And we have absolutely no access to that process at all. I suppose it's very obvious in the case of vision, and people are less sure about it in other cases. And I want to say, hold your intuitions with vision. So in the case of vision, if I show you supposing I show you a painting and you say, that's it's 19th century, or it's a vase of flowers or something. Supposing I say, well, what makes you think it's a vase of flowers, or what makes you think it's from the 19th century? I mean, it's just not easy to say the answer to that. In fact, if it was easy to say, we could do computer vision very easily, because we could write down all that clever stuff, all that knowledge. We could write it into a computer program, and then we'd have a computer program that would recognize vases of flowers and be able to tell whether a painting is from the 19th century. But we can't do that. Now, we can tell a story. I can say, oh, well, the brush strokes, they kind of don't see that's kind of fairly loose, and maybe it's impressionist, and maybe it's this artist. And I can tell a story, but it's obviously retrospective. It's obviously slow and ad hoc, and not really what drove my behaviour. And I think that's always true. That's just the normal situation. And when we explain what we think, why we think it, we never know. We're inventing a story.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's very interesting that in my question, I referred to the subconscious mind, but then you preferred referring to brain operations. So I would like to ask you, do you think that perhaps one way that we complicate things when thinking about how we behave and how we think or not, we will get there, right? But at least to interpret each other's behavior, this sort of dualism that is innate to us of making the distinction between mind and brain. So do you think that distinction is useful, or it is just something that comes to us naturally and it is very difficult for us to get rid of it?
Yes, this is a really deep and tricky question, and I don't feel completely sure what the right answer is to it. And I think about this a lot. I do think there's something fundamentally different about the things we are consciously aware of and the other things our brain does. So almost the brain, most of the activity of the brain is, as I say, utterly mysterious to us. We can say nothing about it. We have this ability to create conscious experiences of patterns and colors, words, faces, but only, as I say, one at a time. So consciousness is very narrow. And so it feels like trying to understand the nature of conscious experience it feels very different from trying to understand the networks of neurons and their interconnections and the whole physical machinery of the brain. It feels like there's an enormous gulf there. Now, so I do want to say that I think it's a mistake we often make is thinking, well, of course, I'm only aware of a few things. I'm aware of a face and a word and so on, one after another. But surely my brain must be aware of so much more. It's got the same, it's also sort of thinking thoughts, just like my conscious thoughts, but they're just lots more. Thoughts about my past, thoughts that lead to my dreams. Maybe my brain's thinking about some problem I was worried about yesterday. And I think that's all completely wrong. the brain is the things that the brain is doing are very complicated, but they are nothing like the things we're consciously aware of at all. So I think using our conscious mind as a sort of window into the brain is a disastrous error. I think it's like we think that the mind is like the tip of an iceberg. So we see the iceberg poking out of the sea, and the illusion we have is thinking, well, I've only got the tip of the iceberg, which is my flow of conscious experience, but I bet the whole iceberg is just the same stuff. And if I could only lift it up, I'd see the whole iceberg. It's all made of ice. And I think that's a terrible illusion, that the machinery underneath that's operating is this incredibly complicated memory retrieval and reuse system, which is searching our past experience and reusing that experience to understand the present. So I'm remembering many past faces I've seen to recognize a new face. All of that stuff is nothing like. First of all, it's fast, it's parallel. It's nothing like the slow sequential nature of the mind. Now, there's a deeper question still, of course, which I think you're hinting at, and quite rightly, which is, yes, well, but is it a mistake to think that there's a fundamental distinction between minds and brains at all? I mean, ultimately, this is the question of dualism, or do we take dualism seriously? And I think the answer, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, and I wish I did, but I think it's to me, it feels undeniably deeply puzzling that we have a conscious flow of experience at all. I think that's a really mysterious thing. Now, I don't feel less puzzled if I say, there's a special stuff called the mind. It's different from physical stuff. That doesn't feel like that makes any. It doesn't help me at all think about why this would have happen to exist. So I don't feel taking a dualist perspective particularly helps make the mystery go away, but it's still a mystery. I think it's very puzzling, actually. It's very deep and mysterious and interesting, and I wish I had something deep to say about it, but I don't.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question, and I think that there hasn't been anyone until now that has completely solved it. So, okay, but yeah, I've already had quite a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the channel. So I would like to ask you, do you think that the approach that is very prevalent in evolutionary psychology nowadays of treating the mind as being composed of different modules, that approach would let us understand a bit better perhaps the issues with us behaving in different ways, in different contexts, with different people and things like that? Because, I mean, we have this sort of necessity to create a narrative self, but it's still true that we're not exactly the same person in different situations and
Yes.
And dealing with different people. So do you think that approach is also helpful to understand this a bit better?
Yes. I want to. I think an evolutionary approach to the mind, as with any other aspect of biology, is clearly very useful. But I don't think it needs to take this modular viewpoint. And actually, I think that the brain is surprisingly unmodular. There's undoubtedly the case that some areas of the brain are largely engaged in vision, some are largely engaged in hearing, some are somewhat engaged in language more than other things. But actually, the overlaps are very, very big. And I think the basic patterns of operation of the brain are remarkably similar from one area to the next. So they all involve perception and memory, in my view. So I think of thought as abstract thought, even thinking about philosophy or mathematics or the law. I think of these as really quite similar in spirit to thinking about recognizing objects or recognizing facial expressions. They're just more abstract versions of that. So I think some people want to argue that there are, and many of course have argued, that there are many different pieces of specialized machinery in your brain, as the Tubian Cosmides Swiss Army knife metaphor. And I'm rather fonder of the idea that actually we can understand a lot about the mind, or at least we should start off with the assumption that the mind has essentially one set of operative principles, and they apply very broadly. So for example, if you think about high-level cognition as we have it, I mean, the ability to think abstractly and so on, this is something that, largely speaking, is, well, we don't quite know how uniquely human it is, but it's certainly especially powerful in us. But the basic cortex that does this is, from an anatomical and functional point of view, looks awfully like the cortex that we use to, and other animals use to do visual analysis. And the normal story in biology, of course, is that you take some piece of machinery that did one job, and then you distort it and change it and adapt it to do some other job. Now, so if you think about the things like legs becoming flippers, if you move your mammal into the sea and it becomes a whale or a dolphin, this tendency to repurpose and reuse existing machinery is very common, and I think that's my default assumption in the case of the brain too. So when the mind is flat, one of the things I'm very keen to do is use lots of analogies from vision, because I think if you take seriously the way vision works, and vision is very complicated, very subtle, very abstract, but also absolutely mysterious to us intuitively. We have no intuitions about what we're doing. That's actually a very good metaphor for the rest of cognition. So I want to push against that modularity approach, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now I would like to ask you to please tell us a little bit more. You've already talked a little bit about this, but perhaps to expand on it, about how our perceptual systems work, because I think this is very important, and it is a big point in your book to understand how the rest of our cognition works, because as you said already, we tend to focus only on a piece of information at a time and at a point in space when using our visual systems and other things like that. So could you explain it a bit better?
Yes. So I think the best way to start, I think, is to think about examples. So one wonderful example is what's called gaze contingent eye tracking. So this is where this was invented by Keith Rayner and George McConkie in about 1973 at MIT, and has been used very great deal since. So it's an amazing effect. So what they do is they set up an eye tracker, so that can look very accurately at where your eye is looking, and then they use that to control what you are seeing. So they'll give you a line of text, could be a whole page, say it's just a line, and then wherever you're looking, you see letters. So it's as if there's a real line of text. Wherever you look, there the letters are. But everywhere you're not looking, there's just X's, or in fact some other language, could be Latin. So there are sequences of characters, but then they're just rubbish. There's nothing there. So I'm looking now, imagine I'm in the experiment, I'm looking now at a particular point in the page, and then 10 characters ahead of where I'm looking, there'll be letters. 5 characters behind, there'll be letters. Everywhere else is X's. So as I move my eye along the page and I read, the real words as it come into view and disappear and come into view and disappear and come into view. And if you were looking over my shoulder, this would be weird. You'd think, well, there's a whole line of X's here. What's going on? And you'd see these letters changing and appearing, the words appearing and disappearing. And you'd think this is very weird. But I don't think it's weird at all, because I just read completely normally. So to me, in the experiment, I just think everything is normal. What's strange? So I read at a normal rate. I don't have any problems. I think this is just normal reading. Now that's true. That's very weird, because I have the feeling I see and recognize words all at once. In fact, if you give me a whole page of a book, I sort of think, well, I can't maybe read all the words at once, but I can see many words. Look, I see words everywhere. But actually, it's roughly true that I only see one word at a time. So people can argue about the details. So, but if you look at standard eye tracking, where we just watch someone's eye bouncing across the page, they roughly look one word at a time. And then, so I read a word, I read the next word, then the next one, then the next one. Now it's not quite that simple, because sometimes words are long, so I may have to do 2 looks. So I look at the beginning of the word, then the end, and sometimes I jump a word. So if there's a short word, which is highly predictable, I don't bother to read that, I just jump it. But roughly speaking, I'm a one word at a time reader. And as I say, in this clever gaze contingent method, If you take away most of the rest of the words, I don't notice. Now, it's not just true for reading. So it turns out, in fact, this is something that we all sort of know but have forgotten from school. It turns out that the colour vision in our eye is centered on about 2 degrees of angle. So it's like looking at a colourful world which is about as wide as your thumb at arm's length. There is a little bit of colour vision outside that. It's not very good, but there is some, but not much. And also, so as you look around the world, you think it's all in colour. Everything's colourful. But you're wrong. In fact, there are indeed gaze contingent eye tracking experiments where you change the colour of things you're not looking at. And as long as you don't change the lightness does affect, you'll spot that because you have special detectors in your periphery and visual periphery which are looking out for change. So if you change the lightness, then the brain will think, hang on, a change. I don't know what it was, but look over there, there's a change. But if you keep the lightness constant, you can change colours and we'll never notice. So I can look around an image and it all seems perfectly colourful, and there's only a little blob in the middle, which is where the colour is. And it's the same for detail. So something else we all know, again, from school biology, but we don't really necessarily take in how bizarre it is. Oh, and I should stress, basically all the colour vision is in the centre of the eye, because we have rod and cone cells. The cone cells are mostly in the centre of the fovea, and they do the colour vision. And the rest of the visual system is which is the rod cells, that they just detect lightness. So they're seeing in black and white. But also, the only part of the visual system that is really good at detailed pattern recognition is, again, the cone cells and the fovea. So our pattern recognition is very poor outside the periphery. So actually, not only are we actually looking at a colourless world, but it's also a blurry world. And it's only when we're looking right at something that it has colour and detail. Now, but then there's a trick that the brain is playing on us. And the trick is that if I look around the room, I think, as I'm doing it now, I think, well, there's just things everywhere. There's mugs and cupboards and clocks, and they're all there. And of course, as I wonder what's in a particular location, I look at it. And as soon as I look at it, ping, there it is. I see a clock. I think, oh, yes. And has it got a hand? Oh, I can see the hands. Has it got numbers? Oh, yes, I can see the numbers. As soon as I ask myself the question, my eye moves and my brain locks on to the relevant bit of the image, and I get an answer. Now, when the answer is so quick, then I have the illusion that the information was already in my brain. And this is the trick we're falling into. So when we imagine that we see the world in full colour and detail, and that when we look at a page, we see words everywhere, what we're really experiencing is that as soon as I ask myself a question, I get an immediate answer. So the answer wasn't really actually loaded in my brain. It was just made up when I asked the question. But it's so fast that I think it was already in my head. Now, that's something that's called it's sometimes called the grand illusion in philosophy, the idea that we're subject to this quite really strange misunderstanding of our own phenomenal experience, our own perceptual experience. We imagine we see a rich, detailed world, but we don't. Now, I think the same grand illusion, and this again goes back to my interest in the idea that perception and thought are very closely related in general. The same grand illusion applies for things like beliefs, desires, preferences, motives. Because if you ask me to justify a belief, I will. I'll give you a justification. And you want me to justify that, I'll give you a justification. And because I'm so fast, our brains are so quick to produce an answer, we think that was already in there. I'd thought of that already. So it's as if I'm reading a book, but I'm not really reading a book, I'm writing a book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. This is really, really very weird.
It is very weird. It's absolutely very weird. Yes.
Yeah, for us to understand that. And I mean, even before I read your book, I think that last year, at a certain point, I was reading another book before I read yours, of course, and I started noticing, wait a minute. I think that I'm not reading all the words that are here, and I still understand
Yes.
all that it's here. So, but I mean, just because I paid a lot of attention to what I was doing, and eventually it simply popped into my mind that I was not really reading all of the words. But I mean, we go through most of our life without really noticing this, and it doesn't make a big impact in our behavior, right?
No, I think the reason it doesn't is that we're so fluid and so quick at switching our attention from one thing to another. So a very interesting question would be, well, can there be a form of neurological damage that stops us moving our attention around? And what would that be like? And there is, and it's a phenomenon called simultagnosia or balance syndrome, as are closely related. And in simultagnosia, you have the very strange experience that you can only see one object at a time. So if you have, for example, if you have two pieces of cutlery, suppose there's a fork here and a spoon here, and you put make a cross, and you put them in front of the patient will say, "I see a fork. Do you see anything else?" "No." "Oh, I see a spoon. Do you see anything else?" "No, just a spoon." And then, and there's a wonderful YouTube video of this kind of interaction. And then the person says, "Oh, I see a blackboard." And now they're looking behind both these objects and they see a blackboard. Did they see anything else? No. So they see one thing, then another thing, then another thing, but everything else is gone phenomenally. Now, I think that's a window into how it is for us all the time. But what we have is the ability, but what the person with simultagnosia has is the inability to disengage fluently. They get stuck. So they have the sense that the rest of the world has disappeared, and then they get unstuck and they find something else. But for us, we can easily jump everywhere. We can look anywhere, direct our attention wherever we want very fluently. So we have this imagination. We can maintain the illusion that it's all loaded in our brains. But as soon as you can't disengage fluently, then suddenly the illusion is punctured.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another very interesting aspect of our cognition that you also address in your book, and you also talk about some experiments that people have done, you yourself as well, I think, is related to our ability to representate things. That is, for example, if we ask people to imagine a tiger, I think it is the example that you give in your book, and then ask them to, for example, try to represent it on a paper as they're seeing it in their heads. We get to know that what we think we have in our minds is really, really very far apart from what it is supposed to represent in the real world, right?
Yes, that's right. And I think one of the things that's so telling about that is if you ask someone to imagine something like a tiger, first of all, and this is Zenon Polishin first observed this in the 70s, very brilliant scientist of vision and imagery. He noticed that you can't actually describe things like how many stripes there are on the tail. As soon as you start to try and count them, well, the image starts to break up, and we have the sense that I had an image a moment ago, and it must have there must have been an answer, how many stripes, but in fact, not really. And even if you try to describe or draw the shape of the stripes, most of us are completely hopeless. We have no idea how they go around the legs, how they go around the face, how they go around the body. It's a complete mystery. And though we have even if we conjure up what we think is a vivid tiger. But another thing that's very telling is that if you ask yourself, you say, well, I've got an image of a tiger now in say some rainforest or jungle or zoo. If you then say, and what's on the ground, or where's the light? Where's the sun? Now, if this was a real scene, there'd be an answer to this. But of course, there isn't an answer. You think, well, I never thought about where the sun is. I don't know. Where's the sun? But of course, there has to be a sun because there has to be shadow. Well, there has to be a light source because you have to determine the shadow. But actually, where's the shadow of the tiger? Nowhere. I didn't have a shadow. So as soon as you ask me a question, of course I can make up an answer. But really, you're revealing the fact that my sketchy tiger isn't a real tiger at all. It's not a kind of hologram, as it were, of a tiger. It's a most high-level abstract description, and it's continually, as you ask questions, it continually morphs and changes. And also when you probe people's imagery carefully, you find that their imagery is also wildly inconsistent. So if you take them to get people to reason about a geometric shape or anything really, and imagine it rotating or twisting, or imagine the shadows it casts by a light on that shape, the things that we say are just incoherent nonsense. They're just just wildly inconsistent. We can't actually recreate an imaginary inner world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and what about emotions? Because in your book, at a certain point, you refer to the Kuleshov effect and
Yes.
the way by which, if we put the same person with the exact same facial expression in different contexts, we interpret it as meaning very different things. Correct?
Yes, I think this is another of those cases where I think there's a very deep lesson from vision for our understanding of high-level thinking. So the Kuleshov effect, as you nicely summarize it, is that if I put the same very impassive, fairly emotion-free face, and I put it next to different things. So if I put it next to a bowl of soup, you look at the person and you think, they look hungry. You put it next to a sad scene, you think, they look sad. And this is, of course, the secret of understated acting. Because the wonderful thing about understated acting is you just look fairly blank. And the viewer thinks, my goodness, you're so subtly expressing the emotion or love or whatever the emotion is appropriate. You the viewer, impose the interpretation. And in general, people's facial expressions are very loosely attached to emotions. There's some lovely examples of this which I didn't actually have in the book, which are photographs of sports people. So people like tennis players, if you just take stills of their faces as they're running around the court, they seem to be expressing all kinds of extraordinary emotions of grief and anger, and these are just, they actually, when you realise they're hitting a ball, it's completely normal. You think, oh yeah, their face is contorted because it's effort or shock or surprise, but it looks as if they're on some kind of spectacular emotional roller coaster journey, because decontextualized faces, a face with no context around it, is very hard to understand. So I think this is a very interesting metaphor for our interpretation of our own bodies and our own feelings. So I think faces are actually very rich stimuli in comparison to our monitoring of our own bodily state. So if I think, am I happy or sad or angry or enthusiastic or whatever emotion, if envious, whatever emotion I'm thinking I might have, then all I really have to go on is the situation I'm in. So I might have a reason to be angry if someone's just pushed me over or something. That's the situation. But in terms of my actual feelings, all I really have is something very crude. Roughly speaking, I have an amount of adrenaline flowing around. So supposing someone pushes me and I nearly fall over, and I have a lot of adrenaline, then I think, I'm really angry. Because look, all this adrenaline, it's come from somewhere. But the very same adrenaline could be caused for some totally different reason. And then I would interpret that same adrenaline as being very, very grief-stricken or very amused or whatever it may be. So a lovely example of this, which I mentioned in the book, is a wonderful experiment at University of British Columbia, where this was the Dutton and Aaron 1974 experiment, fantastically clever. So what they do is they station attractive female experimenters at the end of a high bridge. So it's a bridge which is quite wobbly, a kind of suspension bridge. It wobbles around. So walking across this bridge is quite a scary experience. And they also, in another part of the campus, they have the same attractive female experimenters interviewing always male bridge crossers. And this is a low bridge, a stable bridge just above the water. And at the end of the experimenters just do some fairly routine set of questions. And they say at the end, for ethical reasons, we have to give you the opportunity to phone us, to get back in touch if you have any questions or concerns. And there really aren't going to be any questions or concerns. It's a very boring experiment. But of course, if the male bridge crosser thinks, wow, she's a very attractive woman, I may call. And they often do call. But they call much more often when they've just walked across a high bridge, which was the prediction. And what's so lovely about that is that you'd think that who you're attracted to and by how much is something that surely just comes from within. it comes from your unconscious and it just bursts out and you experience it. But even this is wrong. It's actually something we have to interpret, just like the Kuleshov effect. So I've got this interpretation of adrenaline in my body, and I'm thinking, where's all this adrenaline come from? Now, in fact, I've just walked across a high bridge. That's why I've got adrenaline in my body. But I'm not thinking about that. Then I meet somebody attractive, and of course I think, this adrenaline. Well, wow, she must be great. Now, this is clearly a crazy illusion, but that's the way our interpretations of our own emotions, our feelings, are who we're attracted to, what we're happy or cross or upset about, how it seems to work. Another very much more prosaic example, everyday example, is work done by Danny Oppenheimer now at Carnegie Mellon. So Danny did lots of interesting experiments, but one I want to highlight is one where he gives people photographs of cars, and the cars either are badly photocopied or well photocopied, and they're luxury cars. And he says, well, which of these luxury cars would you most prefer to buy? And people tend, not surprisingly, to choose the one that has a nice picture. So it has a nice picture, it looks clear and clean, and the one that's got a grainy, horrible picture, you don't so much like it. Now, of course, I'm not really asking you about the picture, I'm asking you about the actual car, but you're affected. But what's great about his experiment is he's able to say to people, in one version, he says, I'm so sorry, I had this problem with my photocopier. I don't know what happened, it's some terrible, some of these photographs are terrible. And that massively reduces the effect. So when people realize, graininess looks kind of ugly, it's the picture, it's the photocopy, it's not the car itself, then they can counteract this effect. But otherwise, we just have a general sense of, I don't like that, and then we think it must be the car. And so the analogous case in the bridge crossing would be, if it were the case, and I don't think anyone's done this experiment, but if it were the case that after walking across the bridge, the experimenter meets you and says, I bet you're feeling a bit full of adrenaline after going across that bridge. That was pretty scary. Then probably the effect is going to be reduced, because then you think, yes, of course, I've got this adrenaline. I've just walked across a bridge, and you don't make the mistake of thinking it's the person that you're just meeting. But yes, it's all sort of indicating that there's a process of continual interpretation of our own bodily experiences as we're going along. So our emotions aren't emerging mysteriously from within. They're matters of interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think this leads us back to what we were talking about earlier when I said that we have this necessity to create a narrative self and to think about I and you and things like that, right? But I mean, in different contexts, we behave differently, and perhaps, for example, just one example that came to my mind now was when, for example, we are with friends and someone makes a joke about us and we laugh. But perhaps if we are with people that we not consider to be our friends, and another person makes the same joke, then we get angry, and then perhaps that leads to a lot of misunderstandings between people, because different people see us behave completely differently with them and with other people. So I think that all of this really puts into question also how we think about personality, because to think about people, to say that people have preferences, I mean, it's also a bit tricky. Right.
I think that's exactly right. And I think we should think of this process of trying to create narratives about our lives as an attempt to make ourselves as coherent as possible. So I think the starting point that people often have intuitively is they think, well, I'm basically completely coherent. I am the person I am. And occasionally I have to adjust when the situation demands it. But basically there's just me with my true self. And I'm just going out there in the world and being pushed around by the world. And I think that's completely the wrong way to think about it. It's more that we've got our contextual reactions to particular situations. So in different environments with different people, we'll behave in different ways. And what our narrative building is trying to do, and is trying to make sense as much as we possibly can, and make our behaviour as coherent as possible. So I think a lot of the time, what we're doing when we're thinking, who am I really? What do I stand for? It's not that we're not asking a question which you could answer by looking inside us. We're trying to make a coherent narrative of our lives, and that is a very important thing to do. I think it's important precisely because the natural state is much closer to chaos. And of course, trying to make a narrative sense of our life, trying to make our lives coherent, is very important for deciding what to do in the future and how to behave, and thinking, oh, I did that in that situation, but actually maybe I shouldn't have, because in some other situation I'd have thought that was a bad thing to do. I should, maybe they're morally the same. And so it's this active process of evaluation and construction. This is something that we're doing actively, and it's a process of shaping ourselves and trying to make our lives make sense in the same way that we're shaping a fictional character if we're writing the character. In the case of a fictional character, we don't have the illusion that we're discovering what they're really like, and people often talk as if they're engaged in a process of trying to understand who they really are, which sounds as if you're looking inside yourself. And I think it's a much more creative process than that. We always underestimate our amazing creativity. We're inventing ourselves, we're creating ourselves, we're shaping stories to make our lives make sense, rather than trying to uncover some sort of hidden cryptic story lurking within our brains.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and why would you say then that we have these illusions, that we think about our behavior and about other people's behavior as having motivations behind it, and people having desires and goals and intentions and all of those things? And then we can also talk about consciousness, which is a big mystery. Because, I mean, if the brain still does all these operations and we would still behave, then why do we have these illusions? Do they have an evolutionary function to them, or not?
I think they do definitely have a function. I think the only way we have of explaining other people and ourselves is in a very local way, explaining people's behavior in terms of their local bits of knowledge and belief. So I think to myself, I see this person going into the shop. They must be trying to buy something. I wonder what it is. And so that locally is the only way we can talk. The illusion we have is that we think, if I put together the snippets like that, so I see the person doing many things, I tell a little story about each one, then I have the illusion that if I put those snippets together, it would like turn into a complete story. But whereas in fact, I think the snippets are all there is. They're not coherent. They don't fit together perfectly. So it's a bit like trying to understand a character in fiction. All you can do is say, well, maybe Anna Karenina this was her motivation, or that was her motivation. But if you looked at all the things she did and all the explanations you might give, they wouldn't be some true. They wouldn't all knit together perfectly. And so an analogy I rather like is the analogy of a rainbow. So if you look at a rainbow, it looks as if it's a 3D object, has real depth. It must land in the ground somewhere. And we all know that's not true. But the thing is that wherever you look at the rainbow, it looks like you think, well, I can see part of it. I can see a bit of the story. It's over in that direction. And somebody else who's standing on a different hill will say, it's over in that direction. But if you actually look at trying to join up the different stories, the different bearings in the case of the rainbow, I think it's over there, you think it's over there, we find they never join up. There's no point where all of our observations join up. And I think that's true of the mind too. So we have a way of understanding bits of behavior moment by moment. But if you try to join them all together, they just don't join together. And I think that's the magic trick that fools us all the time. We think it's a bit like, it's just like looking at a rainbow and thinking, it must be three-dimensional. It must hit the ground somewhere, and so that's, I suppose, the illusion that one has if one thinks, if only I had the right brain scanner, if only I had the right method of psychoanalysis, I could get to the real truth about what this person's motivations really are. But in fact, we're incoherent beings. We are inconsistent. So if you explain my behavior 1 minute and explain it another minute, the answers will be inconsistent, because I am not a fully coherent being, any more than the rainbow is a fully three-dimensional, in fact, not a three-dimensional object at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and now to get to the epilogue of your book, at least if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken, this is part of the epilogue where
Yes.
you talk about imagination and the importance that it has. So I mean, it is pretty clear at this point that the things we come up with don't really correspond to something real, but
Yeah.
they can
Yeah.
still serve a function. And I mean, anyways, we can't really get rid of them. So
Yes.
why are they important?
I think they're important because they shape the way we understand ourselves and the way we shape our future. So I think of them as I was saying, really, as creative processes. And those creative processes are very important in the creation of our own lives. So, without the ability to synthesize our behavior and try to create stories about it, we would sort of descend into utter chaos. And indeed, that can happen to us. We can have periods in our lives where we do think, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what I'm trying to achieve, I'm lost. And I think so that this process of narrative building is very important, but it's important as a sort of constructive goal. It's not that I need to hunt about for my true narrative and find it. It's that I need to create a narrative. Just as I need to create a narrative if I'm writing a fictional character, I need to create a narrative for that fictional character. But I think that's absolutely a fundamental importance, and I think we tend to be much happier and more directed, and our lives go much better when we feel we have some, not perfectly clear, but some sense of a story that makes sense of our lives and makes sense of our relationships and makes sense of who we are. And of course, the positive aspect of that is that to the extent that our minds are our own creation, we have some control over them. Not perfect control, but we can shape our own thoughts. We can shape our own narratives, and not with without limits. I can't shape myself into being a world-class tennis player or shape myself into being a world-class saxophone player or theoretical physicist. But I can gradually help myself think differently and shape the way I interact with other people and the way I think. And so over long periods of time, we actually do to some degree control our own destiny.
Mhm. Okay, so just one last question, and I want to ask you this because it is a very hot topic nowadays. So, if your thesis is correct, and all of these things that we experience are nothing but illusions, would you say that, for example, if we were to completely map out a human brain and then reproduce it in another form to create artificial intelligence that would resemble a human as much as possible in terms of its brain operations, would you say that it would be possible that those physical arrangements would produce the same illusions in terms of emotions, consciousness, and other stuff like that?
Yes. This is a deep and interesting question. I'm slightly torn on this one. So I want to say, first of all, I think it's very hard to imagine that happening, certainly from my perspective. So I think when you think about what the brain is doing, it's because of its amazing creativity, its amazing creative construction of stories and plans, and from past experiences and memories and actions and so on. I think we are so far from understanding how to do that we shouldn't delude ourselves that it's going to be a simple matter to recreate anything like the brain. So of course, sometimes people like, for example, philosopher John Searle will say, well, could you imagine recreating a brain as a Chinese room, or maybe it could be an array of bits of silicon or whatever you like, and it feels very weird. It feels like, well, that can't be right. We couldn't do that. We couldn't turn the brain into some computing machine which was somehow very different from our brains. And I think one of the reasons we have that intuition is that we have the intuition that human beings are very, very complex and we don't understand them very well. We couldn't ever actually carry out that task. And I think that's right. I think it's very hard to see, and I don't think artificial intelligence is anywhere near that. However, I think that's the reason we feel intuitively uncomfortable with the idea that we could take the human intelligence and map it into some other form. The intuition is, wow, that's just way too difficult. I think it is too difficult, but it's not in some sense deeply in principle impossible as far as I can see. I don't see why, if I could, as it were, do a 3D copy of my brain in all its detail, I guess it would start chattering away and explaining its behavior just like I do. You'd probably be saying, he's not the original, it's me, I'm the original one. And I think, it's ultimately, I do believe, I suppose, that the experiences that we have are ultimately determined by our brain mechanisms. And in principle, of course, one perhaps could imagine turning that same computational experience, those same calculations, those same pieces of information processing, and putting them into a piece of silicon. That's so hard to imagine actually doing. I don't know whether it's even worth worrying about. But I suppose if we could do it, then that would be a believing, thinking system in the same way that I am, with all the same illusions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Chatter, just before we go, would you like perhaps to share people what are some of the other sources, apart from your book, that they can find on the internet to get in touch with your work?
Well, so in terms of my work, just put me into Google and you'll get my website. So that's one thing. There's a short article in The Observer, which if you put The Observer and Nick Chater, that will give you a short 3,000 word discussion of the approach. And there's also an article in the Wall Street Journal on the fact that we see much less than we think. So again, Google will reveal that. And of course, there are so many other interesting writers on these topics. My own work, in more than I realized as I was writing the book, I think is very influenced by the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who has thought had very big influence on my thinking. And I think it's always very well worth reading on these issues. But there's an enormous number of fascinating pieces. The book itself and has lots of pointers to the rest of the literature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So, Dr. Chatter, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone. And I really hope I was able to be clear enough in terms of the phrasing of my questions, because these are very difficult topics even to think about them. So
No, thank you very much. No, excellent questions. I really enjoyed it, and I hope people have got have got some interest from it. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.